Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of the past 10 or so days of my reading. The most recent thing that I finished is a book that I've actually been picking through for a couple of months, and this is Jean Moorcroft Wilson's new biography of Robert Graves. This covers his life from his childhood through to the publication of Goodbye to All That. It goes through a lot of the bits about both his family's background, the whole social circle of a lot of the famous war poets and writers and memoirists were in his social circle, so if you're interested in seeing how Sassoon and Blunden and Lawrence and etc. felt about things, there are a lot of references to this. This is definitely a book that made me wish that other books that I own were not in storage now. There were multiple times where I wanted to consult my collected letters of Edith Sitwell just to follow up on some of the things that are commented on here, but they're about third parties. It's definitely a book that encourages other research if that's what you're interested in. If you're not interested in Robert Graves' life, I'm not really sure why you would pick this up, especially because the childhood part of this is quite dry. I would say that if you were reading this straight through as opposed to going through the index and picking out the pieces you're interested in to begin with, I would say that this is less interesting than the equivalent first volume of the same author's biography of Siegfried Sassoon, and which is the orange book that says Sassoon on the back that people used to comment on when that was behind me in some of the videos that were in my last house. In any case, this is great fun because Robert Graves was kind of a ridiculous person in a lot of ways. If you've read Goodbye to All That, you know that that's really one of the funniest of the major First World War memoirs. It's ridiculous in a way that most of the memoirs, which are very serious and have goals of trying to get things right, and his is more almost tabloidy, and his life was a little tabloidy. He had an open relationship with his wife, and one of the things they mention is that his girlfriend, who he had while he was married, was in hospital and he needed to raise money, and that's why he wrote Goodbye to All That, so that he could get money to help out his girlfriend. Which is all stuff that you could imagine reading celebrity gossip of somebody now, but it's Robert Graves. So I had great fun reading this, but I am also someone who has this collected letters of Edith Sitwell sitting on my shelf normally, and the biographies of Sassoon and all those memoirs, and books about George Mallory, because there's stuff about him in here as well, and yeah. If you are a fan of this era of writer, I think this gives a lot of context to that. Though I wouldn't recommend this book as an introduction to him. I would suggest reading Goodbye to All That, because bits of this are dry, but yeah, I had great fun reading that. And next up, I read a book of short stories, Lot, by Bryan Washington. This is a series of short stories, all of which are set in Houston, and each story is given a name that is either an intersection, a neighborhood, or a street name. So we're closing in on about 10 months since I left Houston, so I am feeling a little bit of nostalgia. Normally I would insert here not about the weather, but it is actually, when you consider the humidex, it's actually hotter in Toronto now than it is in Houston right at this particular moment. It's 43 with the humidex here, which is 109 in Fahrenheit, and is ungodly hot, but it is normally cooler here. Anyway, that has nothing to do with this book. Every other story in this is following a particular family, and mostly the son in this family, and it follows basically a working class family in which the father is Mexican-American, the mother is black, and they have this restaurant, and then they live on top of the restaurant, and how their lives progress as different family things happen, as the father moves out when they sell the house, as the sister moves out and has a child, as the main narrator character starts exploring his sexuality, and as the neighborhood changes around them in part. I thought that the connectedness of those was probably the most compelling part of this, so I would almost have rather read that as a packaged together as a novel with time gaps as opposed to a group of short stories, because I don't think the voices were particularly differentiated enough in the every other story that was not part of that grouping. And because the voices weren't differentiated, it was sometimes surprising when you would find out that no, this is a completely different person of a completely different background, of a completely different age, or at a different time, things like that. And so I think that was a bit of a weakness of this, but I did overall quite enjoy this. But my bias is I had some nostalgia going on for Houston, so and this worked for that. I enjoyed picking that up, but your desire to read half connected short stories and half not may vary. I was also listening to an audiobook this week, and that was Samantha Irby's collection of humor / memoir-esque essays, We Are Never Meeting in Real Life. She's someone who I find very funny as a comedian when she's speaking, but the style in which she writes her blog, the way it's laid out, just drives me crazy, and I just can't handle it visually. I haven't actually picked up the physical book to see if it's written the way the blog is written, but I was afraid that it was, so the audiobook was the way to go for this. Because of some of the personal information that gets shared in it, I also think the audio is the way to go for this, just because, at least for me, I sometimes talk about memoirs where I feel like people are oversharing with me, and I don't have that relationship with you. Why are you telling me that? But in the form of an audiobook, which takes longer to listen to, and especially because I don't listen to them all at once, I listen to about an hour a day while I'm walking the dog, it feels like week-long relationship, so it's okay if I'm hearing these overly personal things. In any case, I thought it was very funny. It is very brash and explicit, so if you are sensitive to that kind of thing, be aware that that's in there. It's very funny because it's essentially talking about being very busy while also claiming to be very lazy, and how that plays out in terms of kind of a chaotic childhood, which with her parents who were quite old when she was born and were both dead by the time she was in university, and then her ridiculous romantic mishap, her relationship with various romantic interests, ex-boyfriends, her current wife, her stepchildren, and there's often a little bit of social commentary sitting in the corner that's not necessarily, I mean, sometimes explicitly mentioned, but that is, I would say, for the most part, more lurking in the background and occasionally jumping to the foreground. So I had great fun with that. I don't know that I would have great fun if I had been reading it, but listening to it, very entertaining. Then I jumped over to comics, and I read volume 3 of the current run on Batwoman, which is written by Marguerite Bennett, who does Bombshells, and was drawn by Fernando Blanco, whose art I really enjoy. My general feeling on Marguerite Bennett is that she does light dialogue and action very well, but when things get a little more serious, I'm never quite impressed with the way her tone hits. So for me, this is a series that I'm looking at purely for the art, for the most part, because it is quite a bit darker than her work on Bombshells. Actually, that reminds me, Bombshells Batwoman is right there. And I'll insert something over here, I guess. But this is basically a retread of the drama with her sister, who is an occasional supervillain / mentally ill person, which, I mean, that's a story that her sister is essentially her Joker to Batman's Joker. That's kind of the analogy. And it's just been done before, so I wasn't that interested in it. But I enjoyed the art, so there you go. Next up, I picked up a review copy from NetGalley of Veerle Hildebrandt's Black Paradise, which is a graphic novel, and I think one of those lightly novelized memoir-type graphic novels, but it basically expands on her actual graphic memoir, Joyride. In the early 90s, her parents, or her father specifically, took a job in Nigeria. She's Belgian, although the characters in this book are German. And Joyride looked at her specific experience. In this one, this German family moves to Nigeria because the father gets this job. The mother quits her job as a nurse. They get there, and at first they're uncomfortable with the level of kind of neo-colonial style mixed racism, classism that a lot of their colleagues have, and they feel like they have this particularly strong family unit. And what we watch is a couple of years of all of that basically falling apart, and the parents basically becoming the people that had horrified them at the first. And it's very harshly told. It's a lot of, her father is less successful at work because he's refusing to play the game where they're bribing people. So even though this should be this thing where he's making this big career step, it's not quite working out. And I think it's worth mentioning that even though the child is the main character in this, this is not a book that was written for children. This is a book that's written for an adult audience. Because the way what is happening is presented, and the way the kind of neo-colonialism of being one of these business-type expat situations is presented is very harsh and very straightforward. And there isn't the moralizing that I think you would expect in a book that's aimed at a younger audience. You as a reader should understand the context of this. Also, there's some semi-graphicness that some people might not want their children to see anyway. I bring that up because looking at other reviews that showed up on NetGalley, I think some people requested this misunderstanding what it was, and were horrified, and like, this is a book about a child and her horribly racist family. Like, well, yes, but it's not a children's book. In any case, I thought it was well done, and it is harsh. And I think anyone who's had the experience of the kind of expat bubble experience, one of the things that I saw in some of these other reviews were people questioning whether you would have a story like that in a country other than one that you would stereotype in the way that I think a lot of Westerners stereotype Nigeria. But having been on an expat type bubble in the United States, a lot of it is the same, because you have that financial buffer that really, there's no other situation in your life in which you have that. And I think sometimes people discuss the term expat as being offensive because they think that expats should just call themselves immigrants. But really, a lot of the time on expat assignments, you're not on an immigrant visa. So from a legal point of view, you're not. And also, unlike someone who's moving on their own, or even as a student or just for a job and not sponsored in the way that expat assignments are, where you have somebody paying for your children to go to the super expensive privately run schools, for housing allowances, so you have your base salary as well as these extras where you just don't have to pay for things. It creates a kind of bubble experience, and I thought this portrayed that very well. But it is uncomfortable. So if you're looking for something where people learn a moral lesson at the end of this, that's not what this is, because it's very straightforwardly, this is what this girl watches happen. So I thought it did that well, but I think it's worth mentioning despite the young narrator, not a kid's book. And as I was going to enter this NetGalley review on that, I noticed that there was still something available for a book that was being published that day. That was While the Serpent Sleeps, a book from Europe Comics, which is one of their BD translations. It's the first volume in a multi-issue series. I assume they're going to be translating more of them. This is about 8th century Vikings, and has a lot of melodrama to it. It's basically a set of action pieces. You get 2 action scenes, a wedding scene, a little dialogue, and then what looks like it's going to be a travel scene, but it turns into an action scene. The art is really, really well done. There are some great shots of horses on a cliff overlooking valleys. There's another one where a carriage is going through ice, and we get to see there are panels that show the top and the bottom. Really nicely done. Yeah, story-wise, it's a little generic, but the translation I thought was better done than you often see. I think there's a tendency to translate comics from French in a really melodramatic style, which I think does a lot of science fiction comics a disservice. But in this case, the translator went a little more naturalistic, so I quite liked that. I'll note everybody's names down below. I should have made a note of that before I started talking. Yeah, I thought it was worth picking up for the art, definitely. Anyway, if you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.